Jessii V, and today we're going to be talking about a very creepy creature named Mr. Widemouth. And let me just say, his name is absolutely terrifying. Imagine meeting someone named Mr. Widemouth. But before we get into that, I just want to show you guys my new sweater that I came out with. It says, "All I want for Christmas is a narwhal." This is like the most me sweater ever. And I feel like it's also super relatable because who wouldn't want a narwhal for Christmas? So it's red and white for the holidays. It's super soft. I know it's hard to see, but the inside has this super soft fabric. Oh my goodness. And they are only available for the Christmas season, so if you guys would like one, I have linked it down below.
All I want for Christmas is a narwhal.
I also just want to say thank you so much for 1 million followers on TikTok. You guys are so amazing. I can't believe I only started that account 2 months ago and we're already at 1 million. So thank you so much for all that support. Alright, so without further ado, let's talk about the story about Mr. Widemouth. Now this is a creepypasta that came out in 2010, and it was written by a user named Perfect Circle 35. Now, I'm not going to be reading this story word for word. I'm more so going to be summarizing each paragraph. So if you want to read this story in full detail and the full amount, I definitely will link it down below. This story is about a boy who's very often. So he was constantly in different houses growing up. But in this one particular home that he lived in Maine, he met a very strange friend that he'll never forget. The day after his 5th birthday, he got very sick, and the doctor told him he had mono. So he had a high fever, he was bedridden, and he was told that he wasn't allowed to do anything for 3 weeks straight. So, being such a young, lively boy, he was very bored being in bed all day. And one day, out of the blue, while he was lying in his room, he met Mr. Widemouth. Now, he can't remember how it happened, but one day, he was just there. He told the boy to call him Mr. Widemouth because his mouth was so large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body. His head, his eyes, his crooked ears, but his mouth was by far the largest part of him. It reminded the boy of a Furby, which I can definitely see the similarities when I saw a picture of Mr. Widemouth. He just looks like the more evil version of one. He also kind of reminds me of the Cheshire Cat with his huge, wide smile. Now, the first few days after this boy had met Mr. Widemouth, nothing significant really happened. They would just sit around together in the boy's room, and Mr. Widemouth would look through all the boy's books and all of his things. But one morning, Mr. Widemouth went up to the boy and said,
"I have a new game that we can play."
But he wanted to wait until the boy's mother was completely out of sight, because he said this was a secret game. Also, it's important to note that this whole entire time, Mr. Widemouth had been trying to hide from the boy's mother, so he'd stay under the boy's bed whenever she was around. So when the mother was out of sight, Mr. Widemouth slid out from underneath the boy's bed and told the boy to follow him down the hall to one of the rooms that had no furniture or wallpaper. It only had this one window at the very back. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and opened this window and then beckoned the boy to come closer to look outside.
"I like to play pretend up here,"
Mr. Widemouth said.
"I like to pretend that there's a big, soft trampoline below this window. And then I jump. And if I pretend hard enough, I bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try."
But the boy looked down and saw that it was a pretty far drop and shook his head. He did not want to play this game. And when he told Mr. Widemouth that, Mr. Widemouth got extremely angry. But after a few moments, he relaxed and said,
"Okay, if you say so."
And then he spent the rest of the day under the boy's bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, the boy saw that Mr. Widemouth was holding this box in his hands, and he said,
"I want to teach you how to juggle. Here are a few things you can practice with."
And when the boy looked in the box, he saw that it was filled with dangerous items from his house, objects that his parents would have never allowed him to play with. So the boy refused to even go near them. So once again, Mr. Widemouth looked extremely angry, but slid back under the boy's bed. The boy began to have trouble sleeping from that night forward, because Mr. Widemouth kept waking him up in the middle of the night to try and get him to play games. But these games weren't really games at all. Instead, they were just things that would put the boy in danger if he did them. The boy was realizing that Mr. Widemouth wasn't so fun to play with anymore. So one day, instead of the boy hanging out in his room like he usually did, he decided to go outside and hang out on his porch. But of course, Mr. Widemouth was waiting for him out there. He said to the boy,
I have something I want you to see. It's safe, I promise.
The boy began following Mr. Widemouth to the beginning of a trail that went through the woods behind his house.
This is an important path,
He told the boy.
I've had a lot of friends around your age, and when they were ready, I took them down this path to a special place. But you aren't ready yet, but one day, I hope I can take you there.
The boy returned to the house, wondering what kind of place was beyond that trail. And then 2 weeks later, it was already time for the boy and his family to move again. So they packed their things, and at 4 a.m., they got into the car to leave. And as they backed out of the driveway, the boy could see Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in his bedroom.
No plans tonight? Spend time with new.
Stood there motionless until the truck was about to turn down the road, and then he gave a little pitiful wave goodbye, but the boy didn't wave back. Years later, the boy returned to the area that his old house was, but it seemed like the house had burned down a few years after his family had left. Out of curiosity, he decided to finally go down that trail in the woods that Mr. Widemouth had shown him. And as he was walking down this trail, part of him felt like Mr. Widemouth was about to jump out in front of him and scare him, but another part of the boy felt like Mr. Widemouth was finally gone for good, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the memorial cemetery, and he noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children. And that's how the story ends, so clearly
I've never fit into any